We can now bring in our international affairs editor, Kethevane Gorjestani. Kethevane, good afternoon. Let's talk about what happened at the United Nations, because we had the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who's calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. Many countries are calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, but the United States is calling for a pause. What's the difference between the two?
Yes, this is really about semantics, but they're very important because unless the Americans back that pause, that ceasefire, and put pressure on the Israelis to do it, it's not going to happen. And the Americans, for now, are using the term humanitarian pause. And John Kirby of the National Security Council yesterday was asked specifically, what exactly do you mean when you say humanitarian pause as opposed to ceasefire? And he was like, he was very clear. He said that there was a big difference between a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire in duration, in scope, in size. So basically what the Americans are supporting is a temporary, geographically constrained pause in fighting, mainly over the Rafah border, for humanitarian aid to get in, and eventually possibly for some Palestinians to get out, those dual citizens that we've been talking about. But he was also very clear as to why the Americans were not talking about a ceasefire. He said, right now, a ceasefire only benefits Hamas. So there was no ambiguity from the Americans about why they're opposed to it. They believe that a general ceasefire in this conflict would benefit Hamas and not anybody else, and that is why they're focused on that humanitarian pause. That said, they stopped short of actually actively calling for that humanitarian pause. Antony Blinken at the UN Security Council, John Kirby in the White House, both saying that it had to be considered in order to help the humanitarian situation, but they stopped short again of actually calling for that humanitarian pause because, of course, this would be the Americans putting pressure on the Israelis to agree to that humanitarian pause.
It's mind-boggling when the death toll is over 5,500. Let's talk about something else, because the situation in Gaza is dire. We all know this. Fuel has not been allowed as part of the aid that is being sent into Gaza, and this, of course, affects hospitals, generators, desalination plants, and this is one thing that seems to divide Americans and Israelis.
Absolutely, because the U.S. has been adamant, as much as they're not calling for a ceasefire or a pause, they are adamant, and they've been repeating it, not since the very beginning, but pretty much since the beginning, that the Israelis, in their response, need to pay attention to how they respond. Joe Biden said it matters how Israel responds, and that focus is, of course, on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and the U.S. has been insisting that food needs to get in, supplies need to get in, water needs to get in, and fuel needs to get in. And in that same briefing with John Kirby, he said, we continue to say that fuel is an important commodity for life and sustainment in Gaza for the Palestinian people that are still there. We continue to push for fuel to get in. He did say that the Biden administration understood the concerns of the Israelis as to why the Israelis don't want fuel to be in a part of this humanitarian aid, because the Israelis are saying, well, fuel gets in, it's not going to go to the hospitals, it's not going to go to the desalination plants, it's going to go to Hamas, and Hamas is going to get its hands on it, and that is why we don't want to get in. So the Americans said they understood, but they still said that you cannot go on like this, that fuel needs to be part of the deal. And as we've seen, there are calls now saying that this is urgently needed because several hospitals are absolutely running out of that fuel, and without fuel, there's no generator and there's no hospital, basically.